Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Katie Blackwell.
You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
And if you don't mind taking off your mask, great. Let's begin by having you state your full name and spell each of your names.
Okay. Katie, K-A-T-I-E, Marie, M-A-R-I-E, Blackwell, B-L-A-C-K-W-E-L-L.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you employed?
Through the Minneapolis Police Department.
What is your current position?
My current position is the inspector of the 5th Precinct.
Right. How long have you been the inspector of the 5th Precinct?
Since January 31st this year.
What was your immediate rank and assignment prior to that?
The commander of the training division.
Now, I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about yourself. First, could you tell us about your educational background in law enforcement?
Sure. So my 2-year associate's degree is in law enforcement through Minneapolis Community and Technical College. My 4-year bachelor degree is in police science through St. Mary's University. My master's degree is in public safety administration from St. Mary's University. I'm a graduate of the Northwestern Police Staff and Command, and I'm just about to complete a 2-year course in United States Army Sergeant Major's Academy, which is equivalent to a master's in leader.
So in addition to being a police officer, you're also in the Minnesota National Guard, is that right?
I am.
At what rank?
E9 Sergeant Major.
Okay. And just for the uninitiated, can you describe where that falls within the ranks of the enlisted?
That is the top enlisted rank that you can achieve.
How long have you been in the Minnesota National Guard?
Over 23 years.
Have you ever deployed?
I have.
Where?
To Bosnia on a peacekeeping mission, and then to Iraq for almost 2 years on a Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Thank you. Can you please tell the jury when you began your law enforcement career with the Minneapolis Police Department?
Sure. So in 1999, I worked with the 2nd Precinct Community Response Team in the neighborhood I grew up in, Northeast Minneapolis. And we basically worked on nuisance livability crimes, narcotics related, alcohol related. And then in 2000, I became a community service officer. I was assigned to the 4th Precinct and the SWAT team. In 2002, I became a police officer, and I worked the 1st Precincts, 2nd Precinct, and 3rd Precinct, mostly 911 response patrol. I did work for 1st Precinct and 3rd Precinct's community response team, which is, I did a lot of ICE work and narcotics-related investigations. And then I did a little time in Violent Offender Task Force, which is known as Safe Streets. That's high felony violent crimes that we worked. In 2012, I was promoted to sergeant, where I worked sex crimes investigations, and then 4th Precinct Patrol supervisor, and then 1st Precinct Patrol supervisor, mostly overseeing 911 response, and then our community response teams, and foot patrol. And then I went to the assault unit to do investigations, and then violent criminal investigation team, which was primarily investigating shootings, and then cold case homicide and homicide detective. I was then promoted in December 2019 to the rank of lieutenant. And I should say during that time, I led the SWAT crisis negotiator team for 5 out of the 7 years. When I became a lieutenant, I was assigned to the training division to create leadership and professional development programs for the department. And then I took on the field training officer program. I was promoted to commander of training in April 14th, 2019, where I oversaw the Police Athletic League, Police Explorers, Community Service Officers, the Academy, police academies, the in-service training, overseeing the subject matter experts, the medical support team, range patrol operations, the crisis intervention team, and the use of force team, as well as recruitment, hiring background, the 911 call center, court liaison, and adult and vulnerable homeless population.
Thank you. And as a person who was in command of the training center, are you familiar with the basic curriculum that was offered at that center during the time period you oversaw the operations?
I was.
And were you also familiar with the various staff and components who provided training at that center?
Yes.
Before we get into a more thorough description of the training center, I need to ask if you're familiar with an individual by the name of Chauvin.
I am.
How are you familiar with that person?
We worked on the same shift. We were community service officers together.
Back prior to becoming a police officer?
Correct.
So you've known this person for approximately how long?
Almost 20 years.
Do you recognize Derek Chauvin in the courtroom today?
I do.
Would you please point to him and describe what he's wearing?
I was sitting over there in a navy blue suit.
May the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant.
It will.
Now, you and the defendant have worked for the Minneapolis Police Department contemporaneously for nearly 20 years.
Correct.
When you came into the police department, did you go through academy training?
I did.
Hey, describe that process.
It was a 16-week police academy that we went through. Everything from, we learned policy, procedure, investigations, defensive tactics, use of force. We did a lot of scenarios at the end that we had to pass. So it was just a wide curriculum of things, report writing, basically anything that pertained to the job.
Okay. And after completing the classroom and practical portion of the academy, when you took it, what was the next step?
Sorry?
What was the next step after completing the practical exercises at the academy and the classroom training?
Oh, so it's a field training program. It's approximately 5 to 6 months long that you would ride with a field training officer.
And then after you completed that, you were able to get your first assignment.
Correct.
Oh, I'd like you to please describe first generally the training center. Where is it located within Minneapolis?
Sure. So it's our training center is a former elementary school that's located on the north side of Minneapolis. And it's just several classrooms that we use for training, as well as auditorium and a gym if we have to do hands-on or practical exercises.
And it was supervised at the commander level, or is supervised at the commander level?
It is.
Can you then describe, currently, or at least at the time of, say, 2020, when you were overseeing it, how is it staffed, or the different positions at the training center?
So there's multiple units out of the Special Operations Center is the training facility. For training, we had full-time instructors, our use of force instructors, our patrol operations, our medical support team, our civilian support staff. We have 2 civilian support staff members. I don't know if you want me to go through the rank structure, but
I do. How many lieutenants were under you?
at the time there was 3 lieutenants.
In what areas?
So one oversaw pre-service, so your academies, and then another one oversaw the use of force program and our range. And then the other one oversaw our leadership professional development programs and assessment center type of things. So they each had individual kind of specialty things that they oversaw.
And who was the lieutenant over the defensive tactics training?
At the time was Lieutenant John Mersil.
Sorry?
Lieutenant Johnny Mersil.
What happens during pre-service training now?
So pre-service is our police academies. We have 2 different types of police academies, a recruit and a cadet program. So they will, currently it's changed a little bit since last year, but the time I was a commander, it was 18 and 19 week police academy that they would go through, that they had to pass before they could enter into their field training officer program. So they endure a lot of use of force and defensive tactics. They train on investigations, they do scenarios, de-escalation, crisis intervention, medical, and heavy emphasis on the policy, manual, and patrol operations.
And the training that's provided, say, for example, with defensive tactics, Is that different in pre-service than the training that's provided during in-service training?
It is not different, it's just longer, they get more of it in the academy.
If you, one moment, Your Honor, if I may. Thank you, Your Honor. Right, and so fair to say that the training that's offered up at the academy, it's just an extended version, a more thorough version of what's offered at in-service.
Correct.
In-service would focus more on classroom training, and there's a curriculum that's been developed by the defensive tactics instructors and teams, is that right?
Yes.
They typically show some kind of a PowerPoint presentation going over the rules and Minneapolis Police Departmental policy, is that right?
Correct.
For in-service. Whereas the academy, they're going to go through that same, some of the same concepts and materials, but in a more extended way.
Yes.
Correct? Now, you've also mentioned a field training program. In order to have the field training program work, you have field training officers, is that right?
Correct.
And sometimes, the field training officers need to be aware of what the people in pre-service are doing as far as what they're learning in defensive tactics, is that right?
Yes.
And so is it true that sometimes field training officers will receive instruction in defensive tactics, for example, just the same as someone in pre-service training?
Correct.
And what is the purpose of making sure that the field training officers are aware of what the training is in pre-service?
So there's consistency of how we grade and how we evaluate recruit officers on the street.
And was the defendant a field training officer?
He was.
Do you know how long he was a field training officer?
I do not know off the top of my head.
Did you select him as a field training officer?
I did.
Now, you've mentioned a variety of different courses that are taken and training that's provided at the Workforce Center. Is it important to keep records of that training?
It's very important.
And why is that?
Because Minnesota Post Board, which is our peace officer standards and training, require us to complete so much training each year. Part of that is the 48 hours of continuing education over the course of 3 years. And with that training has to be annual use of force, weapons qualifications, mental health crises, procedural justice. So a third of that training, 16 hours roughly out of that 48 hours, has to be in compliance with the Minnesota Post Board. And so keeping those records are critical to make sure we can, when we bring them to Post Board, they can do an audit on them.
And you rely on those records in order to, in fact, make these reportings to the Post Board so that you have qualified officers on your staff, is that right?
Correct.
They're kept in the ordinary course of your business, I guess, in the police department?
They are.
This time I'd like to show the witness only, Exhibit 203 for identification. All right, Inspector, you take a look at Exhibit 203 and I'll ask you to rotate through some of the pages so the witness can examine. You familiar with these records?
I am.
How are you familiar with them?
So these are training records that we track in our workforce director system. We maintain these records. Each officer has to sign in at training, usually in the morning and the afternoon. And then our civilian coordinator will upload these into the officer's file so we can keep track of the training, or if somebody didn't make the training, who needs to make it up. And it's in-service training and any additional training that they had on duty.
And I'd like you to go to the back page to show the last page of the witness. Right, and you see that this particular workforce record goes back to 2003. Why is that?
That's when workforce director started, I believe.
Prior to that, there was some different system.
Just paper.
system. And how long are those records retained?
So in Workforce Director or in our,
How long does MPD retain the training records pre-Workforce Director?
so the city retains records for 7 years. So once we have them, we'll keep this in our Workforce Director. And some training syllabuses and itineraries are put on an M drive. Paper copies are generally archived at some point. They're brought down to a central location within the city.
But for 7 years?
Correct.
Okay. So these are the records that we have available for this particular individual, going back to 2003, is that
Yes.
right? Okay. Is Exhibit 203 the defendant's training records? Exhibit 203, is this
Yes.
the training records of the defendant?
Yes, it is.
I'll offer Exhibit 203.
Any objection? No objection. 203 is received.
Permission to publish. And so I'd like to just, if you could scroll up and highlight this first record entry here. You can see these records are organized in a way that just generally labels the course, and it gives various dates, and then there's a start date and an end date for the participant. Is that right?
Correct.
And then a total number of continuing education credits that are logged. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to back up through these records. If you could bring it out again. If you could slide down, please. All right, so just for example, we can take a look at what's labeled here in 2019 annual training, that section there. All right, and so you see with these records, it's listed as a 2019 annual in-service training, and it refers to a phase 3. Right. What is the annual in-service training?
So our annual in-service training usually consists of 3 phases of training. The first phase will have 2 days of in-service training for officers, so approximately 14 to 16 hours from January to roughly April. And then phase 2 will roll into our shotgun qualifications or medical training, depending on the curriculum that year, what's in that. And that's usually kind of the beginning of the summer months and the end of the summer months. And then phase 3 is our fall in-service training. And the same thing, it's usually 2 days of different curriculum that we're mandated to do, or that maybe the chief wants us to do, or that we're trying to do professional development courses.
And so regardless of the specific trainer, if an individual from MPD is taking phase 3 2019 annual in-service training, should they be learning the same thing on that particular day as anyone else in MPD taking phase 3 training?
Yes, they should.
If you could zoom out again, go down to 2018 FTO, next page. Oops. Okay, here you see what's marked as a 2018 FTO training program. FTO is Field Training Officer, correct?
Yes.
And so is this a train the trainer program?
Yes, from the FTO coordinator and myself as the FTO lieutenant at the time put on that training, where we brought in a variety of different instructors to teach at that class.
And what is taught at FTO training?
So that was a almost 40-hour course, and we taught, it was a primary emphasis on leadership, the critical decision-making model, effective rope, or it's a recruit observation, performance evaluation report, really. So the FTOs are taught the FTO manual, and then they're giving tips on train the adult learner. And we do some scenarios in there where they debrief using the critical decision-making model. They had defensive tactics. They had a component of human resources that came in to explain what the do's and of their jobs are. as a field training officer. It's basically, we were trying to make sure that they understood what the recruits were being taught, because they were going to evaluate them out there, and they're the closest thing to a supervisor that young recruit officer has.
And if I understood your prior testimony, defensive tactics and use of force is something that's trained every year during the regular in-service, is that right?
Correct.
So, for example, in 2018, the defendant would have been instructed in defensive tactics and proper use of force at least twice, right? Once during this 2018 FTO training program and once during the regular in-service.
Correct.
And if we can, I'd like to at this time, just to the witness, display Exhibit 275. At Exhibit 275, does that appear to be handwritten records, like a sign-in roster for a particular course?
It is.
The particular course includes patrol ops, and there's a parenthesis, as taught in the academy, and defensive tactics as taught in the academy. Is that right?
Correct.
And the second name on this list, does that appear to be the name of the defendant?
It is.
Right, and so does Exhibit 275 indicate that the defendant did receive on November 30, 2018, a block of defensive tactics training as taught in the academy?
Yes.
Offer Exhibit 275.
No objection.
275 is received.
Permission to publish.
Yeah.
And if you could highlight this portion. And you can see the number of training hours here was 8, is that right?
Correct.
And so that would have been divided between patrol ops and defensive tactics as taught in the academy.
Yes.
And again, the purpose is so that a person can be an effective field training officer and know what the trainees or the cadets and recruits are being taught in pre-service. Is that right?
Yes.
We could go back then to 203. She'll go to the second page, page 2 of 7, and where it says 2018, this one. If you could highlight that, please. Oh, it's up for me. Is it just quit? Or?
You want to publish?
Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Permission to publish. You highlight that section, please. And just to define some terms here, you see it says 2018 shotgun and CIT training. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's a 7-hour block.
Yes.
Correct. And CIT, what does that stand for?
That is crisis intervention training, so de-escalation and mental health awareness.
You also see there's a training indicated for procedural justice and Narcan training in 2018, correct?
Yes.
And on the crisis intervention training, this one is a fairly short crisis intervention training block, is that right?
Correct. They switched days, so one group would go to qualify with shotguns, and the other group would be in CIT, and they'd flip-flop after lunch.
But the original crisis intervention training block or model that's taught to MPD officers, it's much longer than 7 hours, or even splitting 7 hours. Is that right?
Yes, it's 40 hours, and this is just a refresher.
Okay. And so then if you could move to the next page, please. And highlight that portion. The one above it too, where it starts at CIT 2016. And so here you see on the defendant's training records, it indicates multiple 8-hour blocks of instruction occurring in November of 2016. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that show where the defendant attended paid crisis intervention training in 2016, the approximate 40-hour course?
It does.
In addition to, if you can take that down, please. In addition to the defensive tactics and use of force training, does in-service training require regular medical or kind of combat lifesaver training?
Yes, we generally do a medical component.
Okay. Can you just please describe what that training entails?
Sure. So our medical support team consists of a full-time trainer, and they have part-time trainers that are certified EMTs or paramedics. They're also police officers. So they will perform, they'll conduct CPR training, Narcan, tourniquet, chest seals, just life-saving measures, they cover positional asphyxia. Sometimes they cover excited delirium, opioids, things that relate to our job when we respond to a call, so they can better assess the situation when they get there and be able to render first aid.
Now, you mentioned the term positional asphyxia. You're familiar with what that is?
Yes.
What is your understanding of positional asphyxia?
So positional asphyxia is if you're in a position where you're not able to adequately breathe. Something is interfering with your airway.
And if an individual is in a prone handcuffed position, for example, face down, that could inhibit their ability to breathe.
Yes.
And cause positional asphyxia.
Yes.
And what are officers trained to do or supposed to do to prevent positional asphyxia?
They're supposed to put them on the side recovery position, which is they're going from prone and just putting them on their side or upright position.
How soon are they supposed to do that prior to or after getting the person under control in the prone position?
As soon as possible.
How long have you known about the potential dangers of positional asphyxia?
We were taught positional asphyxia all the way back to my academy.
At the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes.
Have the dangers of positional asphyxia been known throughout the department at least as long as you've been employed there?
Correct.
And your employment overlaps, with the defendants, is that correct?
Yes.
As part of the medical training, do you, in addition to the actual how-to of providing emergency medical care, are officers taught their obligations to provide and render emergency assistance when the circumstances arise?
Yes, it's in policy as well as training.
You're familiar with the Minneapolis critical decision-making model?
I am.
And that model, you've seen the circle, we've all seen the circle now a few times, that model is infused throughout different portions of the training materials at MPD, is that right?
It is.
Why is that?
We wanted to ensure the officers, a lot of experienced officers understand that critical decision-making model. The more experience you have, the more you can walk through it. But we found it critical that recruits learn it early on. It was helping them connect the dots better with information they were receiving on the scene and working through that wheel, constantly reassessing, and then using the pillars of procedural justice in the middle. And so we wanted it consistent with our field training officer program to debrief them, the recruits, and then our in-service, so that officers out there could constantly reassess situations when they're on a scene.
You said that the critical decision-making model was used to reassess people who are going through the FTO process?
Yes, in the field training officer program, we had scenarios where we had the field training officer debrief. At the time, we used community service officers as role players, so we had them debrief using that after a scenario.
So going through the steps of taking in information, assessing risk, assessing threats, reassessing, evaluating goals, and then relating that to the pillars of procedural justice. That's something that any field training officer would be required to do with the people that they're evaluating, correct?
Correct.
In your defensive tactics training, you are not only showing or having officers learn, sort of the nuts and bolts of defensive tactics, but also the rules of engagement. Is that right?
Correct.
Right. And those are contained in the Minneapolis Police Departmental policies. Is that right?
Yes.
And the rules are the rules. They apply to everyone. They apply to you.
Yes.
They apply to recruits. They apply to cadets. They apply to people on field training and experienced officers as well. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. I need to ask you, officer, as you look at Exhibit 17, is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And why not?
Well, use of force according to policy has to be, consistent with MPD training. And what we train are neck restraints, the conscious and unconscious neck restraint. So per policy, a neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck using an arm or leg. But what we train is using one arm or two arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
You can take that down. Thank you. I have no further questions.
You may.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, sir.
Just want a few follow-up questions. In terms of any in-service, you see, when we look at the exhibit, you see 2020 defensive tactics in service, and it's worth 8 hours of time. Agreed?
Correct.
Now, in that course of that 8 hours, officers may go through multiple trainings during that 8-hour time, right?
Correct. They rotate through things.
I'm sorry?
They can rotate through different.
Right. So within that 8-hour time frame, they may get a class or an hour-long class on, say, the human factors of force, or they may get an hour-long course on handcuffing techniques. It varies within each of those 8-hour time frames, right?
Correct.
Now, have you maintained a list that shows 2020, these are the classes that occurred during those 8 hours?
We have.
Okay. And have you provided that list to, in response to the search warrant that was executed at the police department?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of the defensive training tactics or any of these continuing education classes, there are other officers that actually train these classes, and multiple officers may appear during that 8-hour time, multiple trainers, right?
Yes, we have part-time trainers.
So there would be maybe one person will teach the human factors of force, someone else may train on crisis intervention, and there'll be multiple instructors, right?
Correct.
But a lot of the instructors will use materials from past instructors, or they'll take combinations of things and they'll just represent it in a slightly different format, right?
At times, yes.
Right. And I just, for the record, I want to ask you, you were served, or the Minneapolis Police Department was served with a search warrant requesting all of the training materials for the four involved officers in this case, right?
Correct.
And so this would be materials that were from, some materials that were from the police academy, some materials that were from in-service, just a variety of different records, right?
Correct.
Some 30,000 pages perhaps?
Thousands, yeah.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Right. Thank you, Inspector. You
Thank
are
you.
excused.